The granite countertops of their Boston penthouse shimmered under the ambient glow of the city at dusk. It was the portrait of American success, a perfect life neatly framed. Yet, when Elena scrolled past an archive photo, a sun-drenched casual snapshot of her husband Andrew, laughing with a woman she barely knew, a muscle twitched near her left eye, too small for anyone to see but too big for her heart to ignore. The perfect frame was cracking, not from a blow but from a silence that had stretched too long, holding a secret too heavy. If these subtle, dangerous fault lines and seemingly perfect lives capture your attention, then stay with me. There are always more truths to unfold behind closed doors. The dinner table was a slab of polished black marble, cold and unforgiving, reflecting the recessed lighting of the back bay dining room like a dark, silent mirror. Elena Sterling, seated at the head, wore a tailored jacket that seemed less like clothing and more like soft armor. Even when she was eating, a slow, meticulous consumption of arugula salad, she looked like she was reviewing a deposition. Across from her, 16-year-old Nora picked at a piece of salmon, her posture a question mark. At the end, 19-year-old Lucas, on break from his upstate college, fiddled with the stem of his water glass, his attention already miles away, navigating the turbulent waters of a social media feed. Andrew, at the foot of the table, watched the small, distant unit of his family, feeling the vast, unbridgeable length of the marble separating them. He had spent the afternoon sketching, the scent of charcoal and vellum still faint on his fingertips, a scent that felt like the only authentic thing he owned. The board meeting went well, Elena said, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of the city, perfectly modulated. We closed the Kingman case, 7 figures. A good day. Lucas offered a rote practice congratulations. Nora said nothing. That's excellent, Elle, Andrew said, forcing a warmth he didn't feel. I'm proud of you. Did that give you a moment to look at the preliminary drawings for the Chicago proposal? Andrew hadn't mentioned the Chicago project in weeks. It was an ambitious, career-defining bid for the reconstruction of a historic library, a project that would require him to be on site, fully dedicated, for at least a year. It represented a chance to finally step out of the shadow of Elena Sterling's husband. He waited, heart ticking an anxious rhythm against his ribs. Elena placed her fork down with surgical precision. The small clink was louder than any shout. Andrew, we've discussed this, she said, her tone shifting from corporate victory to parental patience, a tone Andrew found infinitely more condescending. Chicago is not an option right now, not with Lucas still finding his footing at Brown and Nora entering the critical junior year. It's a year, Elle, and it's not just a nice project. It's what I've been working toward for 5 years. My firm needs a definitive answer by the end of the week. They're offering me the lead design role. Elena looked at him, her eyes usually sharp and calculating, now coolly dismissive. Then tell them no. It's a library, Andrew, not the cure for cancer. There will be other projects when the children are more settled. She gave a faint, impatient sigh. Frankly, I need you here. I can't be responsible for all the moving parts. The foundation is here, the family is here. Then came the line, the phrase she had rehearsed subconsciously, the summation of their decade together, delivered not with malice, but with a horrifying clinical certainty. My family comes first, Andrew, always, and that includes putting the children's stability over your hobbies. The word hobbies hung in the rarefied air of the penthouse, sharp and metallic. Lucas's head snapped up from his phone, a flicker of discomfort, maybe even shame crossing his face. Elena finally looked up, her large, dark eyes shifting from her mother to Andrew, witnessing the surgical blow. Andrew felt the air press out of his lungs. He hadn't asked for a declaration of loyalty, only a small space for his own professional identity. To have his life's work, the hours of sleepless drafting, the architectural vision that defined him, reduced to a hobby in front of his children, was the final clean break. It wasn't just a dismissal of his career, it was a dismissal of him. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken resentment. Elena, oblivious to the wound she had inflicted, returned to her salad, the matter settled. You're right, of course, Andrew said, the words smooth, too smooth. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Stability is paramount. You are absolutely right. I'll decline the Chicago offer tomorrow. He excused himself before dessert, claiming a sudden headache. He didn't go to his office or the bedroom. He went to the small, rarely used guest room overlooking the twinkling sprawl of the city. He pulled out his suitcase, the well-worn leather one that he had used for his single pre-Elena backpacking trip through Europe. He opened his laptop, not to draft a rejection email for Chicago, but to reply to an email he had received weeks ago from a Geneva-based nonprofit. They needed an architect to oversee the construction of a low-income housing complex, a passion project, demanding, low-profile, and utterly non-negotiable for at least 10 months. He had previously dismissed it as impractical. Now it felt like salvation. Subject: Geneva opportunity. Body: please confirm my availability. I can be on site within 3 weeks. He pressed send and closed the laptop, letting the click echo the small, painful finality of his decision. He was putting himself last, just as she had requested, but on his own terms. He was removing the man she had put last, to see if the structure of the family she prioritized could truly stand without the foundation she had taken for granted. He looked out at the lights of the city, the beautiful, unforgiving geometry of a world that always demanded a price, even for peace. He was leaving, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating sound of a door clicking shut. He would be gone in 3 weeks, and he would not look back.
6 weeks, 42 days. Elena tracked Andrew's absence with the same dispassionate efficiency she used for billable hours. He had left exactly 21 days after the dinner. The departure itself, a quiet, almost bureaucratic event. He had kissed Nora goodbye on the forehead, a long silent moment that made Nora clutch his shirt, and offered Lucas a handshake and a rare, sincere word of caution. Watch your own integrity, kid. It's the only thing you truly own. To Elena, he had given a stiff, non-committal kiss on the cheek, a gesture as cold and formal as the closing of a contract. Now the silence was the heaviest thing in the penthouse. It wasn't the absence of noise. The city still hummed outside the triple-paned windows, and the staff still moved efficiently through the apartment. It was the absence of a certain kind of low-frequency emotional hum that Andrew, in his quiet presence, had generated. He was the shock absorber of the Sterling household, silently absorbing the daily frictions between Elena's towering expectations and her children's developing, messy realities. Elena tried to compensate using her best tools, logistics, and money. She hired a new high-end tutor for Nora's AP history, a Princeton graduate with impeccable references. She increased Lucas's monthly allowance, assuming his occasional, distant panic texts were about trivial financial woes. She doubled her own hours at the firm, using the extra work as proof that the family's continued success was her unwavering priority, exactly as she had declared. Yet, success felt suddenly hollow. On a Tuesday evening, Elena returned late from the office to find Nora in the kitchen, not studying, but scrolling aggressively through old photos on her tablet. Nora had dark circles under her eyes, the familiar sign of a night spent battling social anxiety rather than sleeping. "Nora, darling, what are you doing? I thought you had a session with the tutor at 7. Nora startled, quickly swiping the screen dark. "She canceled. Sick day. I was just looking at pictures from that trip to the vineyard." "Oh, well, let me send her a sternly worded email about last-minute cancellations. This is not acceptable. You need to keep up the pace." She moved to the pristine Sub-Zero fridge, pulling out a prepackaged meal labeled Elena, 700 cals, salmon. "It's fine, Mom," Nora said, her voice small. "It was just nice, that's all. Remember when Andrew taught me how to skip stones on that beach? He had such patience, even when I kept throwing them like a potato." The shift to Andrew was seamless, involuntary. It felt like a subtle emotional betrayal. "Andrew is in Geneva, Nora, working on something important, and I have every faith that Miss Albright can manage your history score just fine. Don't get distracted by nostalgia. Focus." Nora simply nodded, her eyes lowered, clutching the tablet like a shield. The conversation died, leaving Elena with a familiar, uncomfortable sensation, the feeling of pressing down on a spring that refused to compress fully. She wanted to hug Nora, to offer a word of comfort, but the right language felt blocked. Andrew would have known. He would have sat down, not mentioned the tutor or history, but just asked Nora which stone was her favorite, and built a quiet, safe moment around that tiny, irrelevant detail. A week later, the cracks widened around Lucas. He was rarely answering her calls, only responding to texts with one-word answers. Elena had dismissed it as typical college boy isolation until she intercepted a financial statement misplaced in the joint email folder. It wasn't a problem of too little allowance. It was a problem of a reckless expenditure, a large, concerning wire transfer to an unknown account, labeled cryptically as fraternity dues, mandatory contribution. Elena printed the statement. The crisp white paper felt accusatory in her hands. She waited until 11:30 p.m., after a particularly brutal negotiation, to call him, bypassing the usual polite text. Lucas answered, his voice thick with sleep or dread. "Mom, is everything okay?" "No, Lucas, everything is not okay. I need you to explain this wire transfer. $5,000, 2 weeks ago? What mandatory contribution requires $5,000 and is not documented in your school budget?" Lucas's initial denial was weak, quickly devolving into evasiveness. It's for an investment group, Mom. A startup. Andrew knows I've been interested in finance. It's part of learning the market." "Andrew? You discussed a $5,000 undocumented transfer with Andrew?" "No, I discussed the idea of investing, not this specific—" He trailed off, defeated. Elena's legal mind was already constructing the worst-case scenario. A scam, illicit gambling, or worse. She demanded transparency, her voice tight with professional authority. "You will send me every piece of correspondence related to this investment group by 8 a.m. tomorrow, Lucas. Do you understand? I need to get ahead of this immediately." She expected compliance. Instead, there was a heavy pause in the line, a hesitation that was more insulting than outright defiance. "Mom," Lucas said, his tone shifting from fear to a weariness that hurt more than fear. "You're treating me like a witness in a deposition. I wish I could talk to Andrew. He wouldn't jump to the most damaging conclusion and threaten to sue a bunch of 20-year-olds. I'm trying to protect you from damaging consequences, Lucas. That is what I do. Andrew is across the globe drawing blueprints. I'm here saving your financial future. This is what family comes first looks like." "No, Mom," he whispered, and the whisper was a punch. "This is what your career looks like translated onto my life. Andrew would just listen first." He hung up. The dial tone buzzed, an irritating, empty noise that filled the expensive kitchen. Elena stared at the phone. For the first time, she felt a sliver of panic that wasn't about deadlines or stock prices. She was the one who kept the family safe, housed, and financially immaculate. She was the fortress, but the fortress was suddenly leaking, and she didn't know how to plug the hole with anything other than litigation or money. These were cracks of the soul, and her soul was too dry, too hard, to offer comfort. She instinctively reached for her laptop, intending to send Andrew an email detailing the Lucas situation, but stopped herself, staring at the cursor. She couldn't admit to him, not yet, that his absence was already making the perfect structure tilt. She knew, in a cold analytical way, that she needed him not for the money or the blueprints, but for the quiet, indispensable act of listening. He was the emotional infrastructure she had never built for, and now that he was gone, the house was settling violently on its shaky legal foundations.
The correspondence Lucas eventually sent at 9:15 a.m. the following day was worse than Elena had imagined. It wasn't a minor investment scam. It was a deeply unethical, borderline fraudulent scheme run by a cabal of wealthy fraternity brothers, exploiting legal loopholes in a burgeoning fintech sector. Lucas, in his desperate need to belong and prove his own financial acumen separate from his mother's empire, had acted as an unwitting intermediary, moving money without fully grasping the complex, toxic nature of the arrangement. The documentation was a lawyer's nightmare: veiled threats, forged signatures on certain internal memos, and a desperate plea from one of the younger members who was considering reporting the entire operation. Lucas was implicated through shared funds and digital paper trails, not by malice but by profound naivety. Elena felt a cold professional rage. This was not a domestic issue. This was a 5-alarm professional threat to her son's future, potentially involving criminal charges or, at the very least, career-ending expulsions and civil suits. She canceled her morning hearings, a radical move, and summoned Lucas home from campus under the guise of an urgent, non-optional family conference. When Lucas arrived at the penthouse that afternoon, he looked brittle, exhausted, and frightened. He sat on the edge of the sleek white sofa, refusing to meet her eye. Elena, in her element, had already spread the documents across the large, imposing glass coffee table, treating the living room like a conference room. "This is indefensible, Lucas," she began, her tone measured, authoritative, and utterly devoid of maternal warmth. "I have already contacted a colleague specializing in white-collar defense. We will initiate a preemptive damage control protocol. First, a statement denying any knowledge of the fraudulent aspect, positioning you as a victim of group pressure. Second, we will cooperate fully with the university's internal investigation, but we will not concede any liability until we have secured a full immunity agreement. Lucas flinched at the word immunity. He looked at the stack of printed emails and forged documents, then back at his mother's perfectly coiffed, unyielding profile. "No, Mom," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "You don't get it. This isn't about legal damage. It's about wrong. Andrew said my integrity is all I own, and this is wrong." Elena pinched the bridge of her nose, a familiar gesture of professional impatience. "Don't be sentimental, Lucas. Right and wrong are subjective variables in a legal context. What matters now is managing the consequences. If you handle this sentimentally, you will be ruined. You'll lose your standing, your academic record, possibly your freedom. I am protecting you from a catastrophic failure of judgment. You're protecting your reputation and your control," Lucas shot back, the accumulated resentment of 6 weeks boiling over. "The other guy, the kid who wants to report them, he's terrified. He knows what he did was wrong too. Andrew would tell me to help him. Andrew would tell me to step up, take the fall from my part and expose the truth so the whole thing collapses." "Andrew is an architect, Lucas, not an ethics professor or a lawyer," Elena hissed, finally losing the carefully constructed composure. "His advice is noble and utterly useless in the real world. You expose them, you expose yourself. We are not doing that. I am your mother, and I am directing our response. You will follow the protocol I set, starting with drafting that statement immediately." She slid a legal pad and a Montblanc pen toward him, a symbol of the corporate world that defined her and which Lucas now utterly rejected. Lucas did not touch the pen. He looked at the table, then around the cold, perfect room that felt like a cage designed by his mother's ambition. "I don't want your defense, Mom. I want to tell the truth. I don't want to win this by lying. I want to face it." "And what about the consequences?" Elena challenged, standing up, her shadow falling over him. "You'll accept being labeled a felon? What about Nora? What about the damage to the family's name? You'd throw away everything Andrew and I worked for." He looked at her then, truly looked, and the pity in his eyes was the most devastating indictment of her entire reasoning. Lucas, who had always been meek and eager to please, had just articulated the exact flaw in the foundation of her entire life. He had weaponized her own dismissal of Andrew against her. She watched him walk out, not slamming the door, but opening and closing it with a quiet finality that echoed Andrew's own departure. He didn't return to his college dorm. He booked a room at a cheap motel downtown, a physical separation from her authority. Later that night, the documents still spread across the coffee table, Elena found herself hovering over a contact detail she had printed out in desperation. The name and Geneva number of Andrew Sterling. She didn't want to call, she just wanted to stare at the name, a monument to the integrity she had foolishly dismissed. She closed her eyes and, in a moment of utter exhaustion, found herself thinking less like a lawyer and more like a desperate mother, wishing for the only man who could speak to her son about morality without using the language of contracts and litigation. She didn't call him, but the urge felt like the first hairline fracture of her carefully constructed self-control. The crisis with Lucas had forced a suffocating silence over the penthouse. Elena, paralyzed by the standoff with her son, who was now refusing to communicate unless she dropped the legal defense protocol, could barely focus on her work, a novelty that deeply unsettled her. She was a woman built on control, and now 2 major variables in her life were refusing to be managed: Lucas's conscience and Andrew's absence. Nora, sensing the tension and the yawning emotional void Andrew had left, retreated into a private digital world. She had always been quieter, more sensitive than her ambitious older brother, and Andrew's patient, consistent presence had been her anchor. His departure, combined with Elena's glacial focus on damage control, left Nora feeling entirely unmoored. The inevitable attempt to find a replacement anchor began subtly. Nora, rifling through an old shoebox in a seldom-used closet, found an outdated, slightly blurry photograph: her biological father, Mark, a man she hadn't seen in over 10 years, a musician who had drifted out of their lives the moment Elena's star began to rise, and Andrew stepped in. Mark was a beautiful mistake from Elena's early 20s, a ghost Elena had successfully exorcised from their narrative. For Nora, Mark represented the chaotic, emotional warmth that the sterile perfection of the penthouse lacked. She found him on Instagram easily enough, a faded photo, a few hundred followers,
and a bio listing his current location in a dusty, sun-baked corner of Southern California. She initiated contact with a tentative direct message, framing it as an innocent historical inquiry. Mark responded immediately, his replies saturated with the performative enthusiasm of a man trying to recapture a past he had willingly abandoned. Elena knew nothing of this covert emotional negotiation taking place late at night under the high ceilings of her flawless home. She was too consumed by the legal labyrinth of Lucas's situation to notice the quiet desperation in her daughter's eyes. The contact culminated in a scheduled video call on a Thursday afternoon when Elena was at the firm. Nora had retreated to her bedroom, securing the lock and drawing the blinds. She waited for the call, her heart hammering against her ribs, rehearsing the small, perfect version of her life she would present. But Mark, seeing her face for the first time in a decade, didn't offer a clean, emotional reconnection. He saw a lifeline. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his face grainy on the screen, his hair longer, his eyes slightly worn. "Look at you. You're all grown up." The conversation quickly devolved. Mark wasn't interested in Nora's life. He was interested in Elena's current income, the size of their apartment, and the school Nora attended. He began to weave a complicated, manipulative story about a vital investment for his music studio, a thinly veiled request for a large sum of money. "I know your mom's a big-shot lawyer now, right? She's loaded. It's for the family, sweetie. Just a loan, a tiny bit of help to get your old man back on his feet so I can, visit more often." Nora felt the air drain out of the room. The chaotic warmth she craved was just more transaction. The only man who had ever asked for nothing, Andrew, was the man she and her mother had pushed away. She ended the call abruptly, deleting the conversation thread immediately. She didn't cry, she froze. The shame was scalding. She hadn't just been disappointed. She had been betrayed by the fantasy she had desperately chased, and the rejection felt worse than 10 years of silence. She realized with a sickening certainty that she had inadvertently validated her mother's decision to put Mark last, but in the process, she had also learned that Andrew's sacrificial loyalty was the true gold. When Elena came home that night, she found Nora rigid in her bed, blankets pulled up to her chin, her face pale. "Nora, are you sick?" Elena asked, placing a hand on her forehead, an awkward, stiff gesture. Nora shook her head, her voice barely a thread of sound. I made a mistake, a bad one. I tried to find Mark, my real dad." Elena stiffened, a flash of cold fury crossing her face, not at Nora, but at the ghost of the man who dared to intrude. "Why would you do that, Nora? He's worthless. I shielded you from him for a reason." Nora whispered. "He wanted money," tears finally escaping, silent and hot on her temples. "He said you were rich, and it was for the family. And I thought maybe he just missed me, but he just wanted money." Then the confession that gutted Elena, delivered with the absolute raw honesty of a frightened child. I feel like he was like you, Mom. Only Andrew never asked us for anything. He just stayed. And we still let you send him away. I shouldn't have done that. I miss Andrew." Elena sat on the edge of the bed, the polished granite of her composure finally cracking. Her children, the very core of the family she had sworn to prioritize, were disintegrating under the weight of her ambition and her transactional view of relationships. Lucas had rejected her legal solutions, and Nora had rejected her romantic history. Both of them were grieving the one constant she had foolishly dismissed as a hobby. She reached for Nora, pulling her close, an unpracticed, desperate hug. It wasn't comfort she was giving. It was a desperate clutch at the wreckage of her domestic empire. In that dark room, holding her trembling daughter, Elena finally understood the crushing truth. Andrew wasn't merely the man she put last. He was the indispensable adhesive she had allowed to dry up and peel away. And now, the structure was failing catastrophically.
Elena sat in her private office at the firm, 2 hours after midnight, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of Manhattan that usually solidified her sense of power.
Tonight, the view was just a cold, indifferent sprawl of light. She hadn't left Boston, but after the double blow of Lucas's moral standoff and Nora's emotional collapse, the city felt alien, judgmental. She was drafting an email to Andrew. It was a task infinitely harder than drafting a 7-figure contract. Contracts were about precision, leverage, and the strategic deployment of power. This email required vulnerability, a currency Elena had deliberately hoarded and refused to spend for years. The cursor blinked mockingly at her on the blank screen. Draft 1. Andrew, I hope the Geneva project is proceeding well. As you know, Lucas is facing some issues regarding a misguided investment group. Nora is also under stress. While I have retained counsel for Lucas and am managing Nora's academic commitments, a parental presence, specifically your voice, given the children's current emotional state, would be beneficial. This is a request for a professional consultation regarding the moral and emotional guidance of the children you raised. Best, Elena. She deleted it immediately. It was too cold, too legalistic. It reduced him to a consultant, and it minimized the children's pain into issues and stress. It was the language of the woman who had called his life's work a hobby. Draft 2. Dearest Andrew, I was wrong. I was so arrogant to think I could handle everything without you. The kids are hurting. They miss you desperately. Lucas is in trouble, real trouble. Not legal trouble, but trouble with his soul. Nora is heartbroken over that musician. I need you to come home. Please, for their sake, if not for mine. I'll make it up to you. Whatever you want. She stared at the second attempt. It was dripping with too much emotion, bordering on the melodramatic cliches she despised. The phrase, "I'll make it up to you," sounded transactional, suggesting his loyalty was a service that could be bought back. Andrew would see through that lie instantly. He didn't want money or favors. He wanted respect, which she was still failing to offer. She pushed back from her mahogany desk, running a hand through her hair. The crisp jacket suddenly felt like a straitjacket. This crisis demanded an honesty that felt physically painful. She had to admit, without caveat or tactical maneuvering, that the family she had prioritized had broken because she had systematically devalued the emotional components only he provided. She pulled up a fresh screen and began to type. Slowly, allowing the words to be driven by the raw, desperate panic that had taken root in her gut. She focused on the children's specific pain, not her own pride. Draft 3, the final draft. Andrew, I am writing this because I have nowhere else to turn. Lucas is refusing my help. He sees my intervention as control, and he is right. He needs to face the ethical choices he made, and he needs your guidance to do that. He won't speak to me because I cannot speak to him about integrity without sounding like a prosecutor. Nora reached out to Mark. It was a disaster. He only wanted money. She is devastated, and I am incapable of comforting her. She keeps saying she misses the stability you provided. The one thing I told you was a hobby. I was wrong about everything I said 6 weeks ago. I defined family comes first by money, reputation, and control. I realize now that you were the center of their emotional safety. I destroyed that safety net when I pushed you away. I am not asking you to come home to me. I know I lost that right. I am asking you to call them, to speak to them, not as a husband, but as the father they chose, the father I foolishly put last. They need you. Elena. She read the draft. It was raw, humbling, and contained the two crucial admissions: her error of judgment and the children's direct, irreplaceable need for him. She did not ask for his love or forgiveness. She asked for his expertise as a person. She attached no documents, no legal summaries, just the painful core of their failing household. She paused for a full minute, her finger hovering over the send button, a terrifying commitment to vulnerability. She pressed it.
watching the small confirmation box pop up on the screen. The weight of the world did not lift, but the stifling weight of her own pride momentarily eased. She then booked a therapy session for Nora for the next morning, and finally, numbly went home, waiting for a reply that might confirm her greatest fear, that the man she put last had finally decided to leave the family behind forever.
Geneva was sharp and clean, a city of efficient lines and breathtaking natural backdrops. Andrew had settled into the role of lead designer with a quiet ferocity he hadn't realized he still possessed. The low-income housing complex, a dense, beautiful honeycomb of sustainable wood and glass, was a project of utility and profound ethical purpose, requiring him to be present, grounded, and focused on community, not luxury. His life mirrored his work, clean, essential, and honest. He lived in a small, well-lit apartment with a view of the Alpine mountains, and his mornings began not with the clatter of Elena's ambitious schedule, but with the quiet clarity of Alpine air. The greatest catalyst for this change was Sophie, his project manager. She was French-Swiss, an engineer with a steady gaze and an aversion to unnecessary drama. Their relationship had begun subtly, born not of forbidden passion, but of shared respect in the easy companionship of two professionals focused on a common, meaningful goal. Sophie saw his talent, his patience, and most importantly, the profound, unacknowledged kindness that Elena had categorized as softness. With Sophie, Andrew felt seen, truly valued, without having to perform or compete. They were having a late dinner at a quiet lakeside cafe when Elena's email arrived. Andrew's phone buzzed discreetly on the wooden table. He had purposefully left notifications for Elena's work email turned off, but the sheer length of the message indicated it was more than a quarterly tax query. He excused himself, walked to the railing overlooking the dark, placid water of Lake Geneva, and opened the message. The first line, "I am writing this because I have nowhere else to turn," was like a physical shock. It was the first honest statement Elena Sterling had ever directed at him outside of a courtroom. As he read through the brief, unflinching breakdown of Lucas's moral crisis and Nora's desperate, failed attempt to connect with Mark, his initial resentment gave way to a cold, sinking, professional horror. He wasn't angry at Elena. He was deeply, instinctively pained for the children. They were hurting, and the wounds were exactly where he had predicted. Not financial, but ethical and emotional. Elena's legal armor was useless against the breakdown of a teenage girl's heart. Sophie joined him moments later, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Difficult news?" she asked, her voice low. "My family, back in Boston," Andrew said, showing her the last few lines of Elena's email, the desperate plea for him to act as a moral compass. She read it, her brow furrowing slightly. She knew the broad strokes of his marriage, the high-powered wife, the stepchildren he adored, the ultimate rejection of his worth. She admitted she was wrong. That is a greater concession than she gives in a deposition, I imagine. "It's a concession born of desperation, not conviction," Andrew corrected, running a thumb over the cold gloss of his phone screen. "She's not asking me back as a husband, she's asking for me as a tool, the only tool capable of fixing this specific damage, the damage she caused when she put me last." Sophie leaned against the railing beside him, her presence comforting and solid. "But the children, Andrew, they're not tools. They're asking for their father. You built that relationship. The woman is irrelevant in this equation." This was the crux of his dilemma, the profound, agonizing choice he now faced. He could go home, fix the children's problems with the calm, honest approach Elena lacked, and save them from the emotional fallout. But that required him to step back into the shadow of Elena's orbit, risking the contamination of his newfound happiness with Sophie, with his work, with his true self. He remembered Nora clutching his shirt. He remembered Lucas's sincere, if misguided, ambition. He remembered the feeling of being entirely responsible for their stability, a feeling that was both suffocating and deeply rewarding. He couldn't abandon them, but he also couldn't go back to the sterile, dismissive existence in the penthouse. He knew he had to respond, but the reply had to be a controlled rejection of Elena's authority, a measured statement of his terms, putting the children first, but himself second, not last. He returned to his apartment alone, leaving Sophie with a lingering promise of a quiet night. He sat at his small, clean desk, pulling up Elena's raw, humbling email. He typed his reply, making sure the tone was measured, distant, and professional, stripping away any hint of the pain or love that still lingered for the children. Subject: RE, no subject, urgent. Elena, I have read your email. I understand the gravity of this situation involving Lucas and Nora. I remain committed to their well-being, as I have been always, regardless of the circumstances that led to my departure. I will call Lucas tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will call Nora the following day. We will conduct these conversations discreetly, focused entirely on offering them the guidance they require. This assistance is provided solely for the benefit of Lucas and Nora. It does not imply a renegotiation of our status, nor does it guarantee my physical return to Boston. My commitment here in Geneva remains firm. I will contact you with an assessment after speaking with them. Andrew. He reread it. It was cold, clinical, and protective. It gave Elena exactly the professional assessment she deserved and the emotional lifeline the children needed. He hit send. He had chosen the children, but he had shielded his heart, making it clear that the man she put last would not be putting himself last ever again. He then immediately called Sophie, needing the simple, honest clarity of her voice to ward off the sudden, chilling weight of the past that had just reached out across the Atlantic.
Andrew's call to Lucas had been a carefully controlled success. He had listened to the boy's confession of moral panic without judgment, guiding him not toward a legal strategy, but toward an honorable path of partial accountability in truth. His call with Nora, equally gentle, had been a simple validation of her pain, assuring her that her worth was not tied to her biological father's failure. The children were momentarily stabilized, buoyed by the quiet authority of the man who saw their hearts, not their mistakes. But Elena remained unsatisfied. Andrew's remote assistance, while invaluable, was not enough. She needed him physically present, not in her bed or at the dining table, but in the vicinity, a solid, non-negotiable presence the children could rely on as they navigated the fallout of their crises. The legal firm's crisis management team had done its job, but the Sterling family needed a father, not a consultant on video call. 2 days after Andrew's second call, Elena did the unthinkable. She canceled a major firm retreat, citing an unforeseen family emergency, and booked a last-minute flight to Geneva. She traveled light, carrying only a small suitcase and, more importantly, shedding the sharp, tailored armor of her professional life. In its place was a quiet, almost defeated vulnerability that felt foreign and terrifying. She found the address through his old professional network contacts, a quiet modern apartment building nestled against a steep, snow-dusted hillside outside the city center. The nonprofit's headquarters was a nearby compound of functional architecture, the project Andrew was immersed in. Elena waited until dusk, knowing Andrew would be back from the site. She stood at his door, the bitter alpine air stinging her cheeks, forcing her to confront the reality. She was standing on the doorstep of the life she had told him was secondary, begging for the man she had carelessly put last. He opened the door, dressed in worn jeans and the thick, soft sweater, the antithesis of the stiff, metropolitan man she had known. His surprise was complete, quickly replaced by a weary, guarded resolve. "Elena, what are you doing here?" His voice was flat, devoid of anger or welcome. "I had to see you. I know you've spoken to them, and thank you, Andrew, truly. But it's not enough. Lucas needs ongoing, daily guidance. Nora is a single misstep away from complete withdrawal. The family is stable right now only because you spoke to them, but I can't maintain it remotely." He leaned against the doorframe, his posture closed. "My terms were clear, Elena. I am here for a reason. I am building something here, something that values my contribution. I will not sacrifice that to be a remote, emotional babysitter for the family that dismissed me." Elena stepped back, her eyes meeting his.
She saw no love there, only a hard protective shell he had built around himself, and she realized the devastating cost of her cruelty. She dropped the suitcase, the sound muffled on the wooden floor. "I know," she whispered, her voice rough, stripped of its courtroom cadence. "I know you won't come back for me, and you shouldn't. You deserve this, Andrew. You deserve to be valued and respected." She took a breath, the cold air burning her throat. This was the hardest concession. "I'm not asking you to come back to the penthouse. I am not asking you to come back to us. I am asking you to come back to them. Just for 6 months. Until Lucas can navigate this ethically and until Nora can believe in her own worth again. You can stay in the guest house. We can file for a legal separation tomorrow. I will make no claim on your time, your affection, or your presence in my life. I will respect the distance you require." He watched her, searching her eyes for the lawyer's manipulation, but finding only the stark, raw fear of a mother who had lost control and was finally ready to pay the price. She saw the truth of her admission. She was sacrificing her pride, her control, and her marriage to save her children. "You want me to walk away from my life here, Elena? Walk away from a project that is nearing its most critical phase? Walk away from the respect I've earned to sit in the periphery of a life you destroyed? And you want me to do this on the promise of a legal separation?" "Yes," she choked out, her voice barely audible, "because the children are my only priority. And I was wrong. I put my ambition first and I put you last, and it nearly destroyed them. I'm begging you, Andrew, not for forgiveness, but for a professional commitment to their emotional recovery. Name your price. Name your terms. I will meet every single one. I just need you to be there for them physically before they collapse completely." He looked past her, into the dark mountains, considering the gravity of the demand. He had found peace, found Sophie, found his worth. Returning meant risking all of it, but the children were his legacy, the only part of the family that had never betrayed him. He could not, in good conscience, let them suffer for Elena's sins. 6 months, Andrew said, his voice flat, resolute. "I'll come back under the condition of a trial separation initiated immediately upon my return. I will stay in the guest house and I will focus exclusively on Lucas and Nora. We will not share meals, social events, or a roof over our respective living quarters. If the children's stability is regained before 6 months, I leave. If not, I leave after 6 months regardless. You accept this, Elena, without negotiation or complaint, or I stay here." Elena nodded immediately, a sudden, desperate surge of relief flooding her chest. "Done. I'll book your flight for tomorrow." He stood there, unmoving, watching the high-powered lawyer, the woman who had won multi-million-dollar cases with a single cold glance, humbled and defeated on his doorstep. He knew he had won the moral war, but the emotional cost of the victory felt crippling. He was returning to the wreckage, not the home.
Andrew arrived back in Boston 2 days later, not to the familiar embrace of his home, but to the cold, clinical reality of his new contract. Elena had followed through on her promise with the precision of a lawyer closing a deal. The guest house, a separate, small architectural unit behind the main penthouse terrace, was immaculate. It was sparsely but thoughtfully furnished, complete with a drafting table and a high-speed fiber connection. A functional space designed for a talented professional, not a returning husband. The first week was a study in painful and forced proximity. Andrew was a ghost in the Sterling life. He had breakfast in the guest house, worked on his Geneva blueprints remotely, and emerged only to interact with the children. His presence was immediate, powerful medicine for Lucas and Nora. Lucas, guided by Andrew's quiet, firm counsel, drafted a statement to his university's ethics committee that was brutally honest, accepting responsibility for his naivety and complicity while exposing the true perpetrators. Andrew did not write it for him. He simply sat with him in the guest house, asking Socratic questions about integrity and long-term consequence, allowing Lucas to rediscover his own moral center. The fallout was severe.
a year's suspension, but Lucas accepted it with a dignity that surprised even Elena. "It's fair," he told her later. "I chose truth over your version of winning." Nora, meanwhile, slowly emerged from her depression. Andrew spent hours teaching her to develop photos in a small, improvised darkroom in the guest house basement, encouraging her artistic eye. He spoke to her about the enduring value of creating something beautiful and honest, a quiet antidote to the failed, superficial promises of her biological father. He did not talk about Elena, he only talked about Nora. Elena watched all of this from the window of the penthouse, a perpetual observer of the life she had once controlled and now desperately needed but was excluded from. She honored her terms scrupulously. They passed in hallways or on the terrace with brief, polite acknowledgments, like highly respected, distant colleagues. There were no shared dinners, no late-night conversations, no lingering looks. The distance was immense, palpable, and professionally maintained. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Elena found herself standing outside the guest house door. She wasn't there to discuss the children. Lucas was studying, Nora was developing film. She was there because the silence of the penthouse had become unbearable, a vacuum that felt less like peace and more like death. She knocked. Andrew opened the door, his face unreadable. "I was just bringing this," Elena said, holding up a small, hand-knitted blanket she had found in the back of a closet, a blanket Andrew had used to cover Nora when she was an infant. Nora was asking about it. Andrew took the blanket, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, sharp with the memory of the decade they had spent in comfortable intimacy. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. The silence returned, longer and heavier than before. Elena's eyes dropped to the floor, then rose again, unable to look away from the man who was sacrificing his happiness for her mistakes. "Andrew," she began, her voice cracking slightly, "I filed the separation papers this morning. I have retained legal counsel for the process. I want to assure you, the terms will be entirely in your favor. I won't fight you on anything. You deserve financial compensation for the years you put your career on hold for the children." Andrew looked at her, his expression a mixture of profound sadness and resolve. "I don't want your money, Elena. That's always been your answer for everything. I was never here for the financial gain. I was here for the love of the children, and I'm still here for the love of the children. Keep the money, put it towards their future." "But you walked away from Geneva, from Sophie. You walked away from a life where you were happy, and I owe you more than just a polite nod." He stepped out onto the threshold, closing the door behind him. "You owe me the respect you promised, Elena, the respect for the boundary I've set. You asked for my help, and I'm giving it. The cost I'm paying is the loss of the peace I found. Don't try to monetize that. Just uphold the agreement." He paused, not looking at her, but toward the main house, toward the windows where their children were slowly beginning to flourish again. "The greatest price you're paying isn't the separation, Elle," he said quietly, the final, painful resolution of their story. "You finally got the stability you prioritized, but you lost the man who made that stability possible. You chose your family, but in the end, you needed the man you put last to save it. And now you have to live next to the ghost of the life you destroyed." Elena stood there, watching him walk back into the guest house, the door clicking shut with the same quiet finality as his departure to Geneva. She had her children's integrity back. The family was safe. But she was utterly, profoundly alone in her gleaming, empty empire. The price of her ambition was the man she realized too late was her truest home. The wounds were closed, but the scars would define the rest of their lives.